Welcome to All Pro Football Data. My name is Jim Coburn, and today's episode we're talking about the Arizona Cardinals 2019 to 2023 NFL Draft Review. So we're going to look at every single draft class that the Arizona Cardinals have had from 2019 to 2023 based on data. Now we're going to look at three main things to measure their performance. The first thing is real approximate value. This is how they actually performed on the football field, which takes into account starts and different stuff like that. If you want to learn more about this metric, go to profootballreference.com. The next score we're going to use in terms of evaluating is the draft approximate value score, which essentially is the average AV of the selections they had. So what was the average approximate value of, say, the sixth selection from 1994 until 2023? That's what that data point measures, is what that average AV is, to kind of see how well they performed based on how other prospects have performed in the past at that selection. And then, of course, we have the average draft value per draft range right here. So you can pause the video real quick. This is typically how most picks perform based on their range as a draft pick, if you will. And as you can see here, it's a general slope. The higher you pick, the more likely the chance is that you're going to have a prospect that performs really well based on these metrics. Then, of course, when you look to expected approximate value score or the data score, this takes a look at things that I do on the metric side of things. So it takes a look at their production as a prospect in college. It takes a look at their athleticism traits. It takes a look at their age and other statistical factors to give them one data grade to kind of judge them based on how well they performed from a data perspective in college. It doesn't really take into account, things like film grades and different stuff like that. I'm sure you definitely could add that in the future to this particular metric, but this is just based on their statistics like production, athleticism, age, other factors like that. Then you have limiting factors. So this is things that you can't really control. So whether they did well in terms of their draft grades, like in terms of their college grades, but they didn't really do much in the NFL, there are things that affect it. One is coaching of the team can affect the development of a prospect. If you go from, say, USC and you go to one of the worst football teams in the NFL, you're going to have a hard time developing, especially if you're a developmental prospect. I mean, how are you going to develop a quarterback who doesn't have a great quarterback coach, doesn't have good wide receivers? So coaching is definitely a big part of it. Another thing is unforeseen injuries can lead to inconsistent outcomes. So if you have a prospect that was really productive and was a great all-around prospect, but had an injury that was season-ending early in their career, that can have an effect on their statistics as well. Of course, the publicity of media markets can influence perception of a prospect, leading to inflated grades. So this is things like the PFF, the mainstream media, those types of outlets. They typically will get a bump to prospects. For example, again, I'm not trying to throw PFF under the bus, but I have noticed that there are some prospects that when you look at what they actually did on the football field, they really didn't do a whole lot, but they graded well according to PFF's grading system, and they got a boost. There have probably even been some prospects that have become all-pro, Pro Bowl players based purely on the fact that they got high PFF grades. Same thing can also be said for fantasy football. If a prospect does really well in terms of fantasy football purposes, getting a lot of points for your team, you're more likely going to vote for them to go to the Pro Bowl or become an All-Pro that year because of fantasy reasons. They weren't necessarily the best wide receiver, but they did well in terms of their fantasy points, so they graded up higher. Another thing to look at is psychological and mental makeup can also affect NFL outcomes. So this just deals with character concerns, how well they are in terms of their character. These are definitely things that can influence things in terms of their data. And then the last thing is called substitution bias. So this allows for the possibility that coaches switch from higher cost prospects to lower cost but lower quality. So, for example, you have a prospect that's doing really well, like say Brandon Ayuk is doing really well for the San Francisco 49ers. Do they want to pay Brandon Ayuk when they also have Deebo Samuel on the team at the same time? No. So you have to make business decisions. Sometimes you have to start a prospect over another prospect or trade that prospect out of there to give another prospect the opportunity to take over when they may not be of similar value as a prospect. So they're starting just because coaches want them to be the starter because of cost reasons. This is not the most common thing ever, but it can affect the statistics because approximate value does measure game starts as an indicator of success. And as we all know, just because a prospect started in the NFL doesn't mean that they necessarily were a good prospect. But with all those limiting factors out of the way, I know it was a lot to talk about in this show. Let's get to the draft classes. So, starting with the overall draft grades. This is how the Arizona Cardinals have performed from 2019 to 2023 in terms of their overall draft grade, their draft approximate value, their real approximate value, and their value grade. The value grade is essentially how well they did for where they took a player. So if the player did better than what the average AV of a prospect at that particular draft spot performed, they would have a better value grade at that place. So essentially, if you took a player, say pick 120, and most players at 120 are backups, and that player ended up becoming a starter, they would perform better in terms of the value grade. Looking at draft positions, this is who the Arizona Cardinals have drafted the most based on their past performances. So quarterbacks is about 5%. Skill positions have been about 22%. 19% has been O line, 22% has been D line, 12% linebackers, and then 20% DBs. So they've mainly drafted DBs, skill position players, and defensive linemen are kind of been the biggest things that they've drafted, in addition to offensive line, but not so much in terms of quarterbacks or linebackers. Looking at 2023, so 2023 was by far their worst draft class, but this is subject to change over time. The biggest reason why it is considered their worst draft class is because it's early. A lot of times it does take some time for prospects to kind of develop as players before they have a lot of success. And I would say that that's kind of what Arizona is right here from that kind of perspective. Paris Johnson did well for them, but he was a good RAV prospect. So his real AV or score was 96.75 out of 100, but that's typically what is expected from a prospect that's picked sixth overall. So you're not really going to get extra points just because you took a really good prospect early in the draft, because that's what you're expected to get. And then Michael Wilson probably would be one of their best draft efficiency grades or draft value grades. He ended up being a pretty significant starter for them. His data grade wasn't that fantastic, but again, he did well. And then probably the last player would be Dante Stills, who saw some decent starts, and he was a pick 213. Most players at that spot do not perform that well at all. But overall, in terms of the draft class, they got players that pretty much were consistent with what you would expect from the picks that they were selected, and they could have done better. I mean, that's the basics of it. I would give the overall draft grade for them as incomplete until we get more seasons under the belt to kind of see how this draft class actually does. I think it's a little too early to kind of grade it at this point. Then we get to 2022. This was their second worst draft class. They did do well in terms of Trey McBride. He had an 82.81 real AV or approximate value score. And they also did well in terms of the other prospects they took, probably like maybe Cameron Thomas. But as you can see here, not a lot of starters, not a lot of significant players through most of their draft class that year. And that's kind of what hurt them, is that they have Trey McBride, but look at the rest of the draft class. Not that great. So most of the player selections did not meet the expectation of where they were drafted, and that is why I have to give them an F. I know I'm a very hard grader, so before you throw me under the bus, just understand I'm very hard in terms of grading these prospects, in terms of their data. So just take this how you will. There's going to be a lot of F grades on most of the teams that I grade. Then we get to the 2021 NFL draft class. This was their second best draft class, but it has underperformed thus far. So Zaven Collins, for example, had a great data grade. He had a 95.33 expected approximate value grade, but his real AV has only been 80.05. Rondell Moore had a 98.71 approximate value grade, but he's only been able to put up a 73.84 real approximate value score. And then Marco Wilson, kind of same difference. He did a little bit better than what his expected AV should have been, but just not getting it done. This draft class, non-existent things in the sixth, seventh round. Again, it's expected, but they didn't really do much in those particular draft areas. And then Collins, Moore, and Wilson have all been disappointing, especially Moore and Collins. Moore is no longer on the team. Zaven Collins is, I don't really know what he is at this point. Is he a linebacker? Is he a rush linebacker? So there's a lot of issues with this particular draft class, which is why they got an F. But they did well in terms of data. I mean, Rondale Moore and Collins had great data scores, but they just haven't really lived up to expectations, which might have to do with coaching, but we'll see. Going to 2020, this was the best draft class, but it has massively underperformed expectations. Isaiah Simmons is on another team where he has moved to safety, but he never lived up to his draft status. He was his expected value score is 99 percentile, and his real AV, what his real actual NFL impact has been about an 80 percentile. So he's underperformed his draft status and what he was expected to do based on his data grade. Josh Jones has also underperformed as well in terms of him, and also when you look at the rest of the draft class, just not a lot of great players in there. So again, this is an F. I'm a very hard grader, don't forget. But this was their best class. So again, the Arizona Cardinals have not really done that well in terms of the draft. They have taken players that have great data grades, but something's not connecting, which I think is kind of the biggest issue for them. And then, of course, you look at the 2019 class. Kyler Murray, of course, headlines this class. He has pretty much lived up to his draft AV. Most quarterbacks do because they have such an impact on their team in terms of starts, passing yards, rushing yards. I mean, the quarterback has their hand in almost everything, so they typically will have decent approximate value scores. Byron Murphy at cornerback has not really lived up to his expectations based on his data grade, only 79 percentile for him. And you just go down the list of all the other prospects in here, just not not there in terms of their data. The rest of the draft class, I would say, would be subpar. And Murray, of course, has been inconsistent as a quarterback, but he did have some good seasons here and there. I think 2021 was a very good season for him, but it's not what you wanted to see. And I would give this class an F. Overall, the Arizona Cardinals have been below average drafters since 2019. It's not surprising they're picking fourth overall this year. The biggest issues have been high value draft picks not meeting the expectations of their draft positions historically. Poor coaching and other structural issues have caused them to score high database grades, but the prospects haven't really turned out to be much of anything. So, in other words, the Cardinals have drafted well in terms of getting prospects that have good data grades, but they haven't been able to translate those data grades into actual, real, approximate value, actual value, how they actually performed at the NFL level. That's the biggest disconnect. I don't know how you fix that 100%. I know some people will say, well, this is why the data doesn't matter. But again, if you took any of these prospects and maybe put them on a different team, there might be different outcomes if they had different coaching, different opportunities. I think there might be some interesting things there. But overall, I do hope the Cardinals improve. But this is kind of how they performed thus far. With all that stuff out of the way, check out these videos right here. If you want to see more content of mine, also check out my X, formerly known as Twitter account, at Geometrics. Check out the Patreon account as well, which is patreon.com/jcoburn. And the 2023 or 24 NFL Draft Analytics Guide is now available. Link is in the description. 678 pages of comprehensive, in-depth data analysis on the 2024 NFL Draft class that you need to buy today to get ahead and a leg up on what other people may not know about this class. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.